Welcome everyone. Today we will be going over what was supposed to be an average psychological study on prison life, but turned out to be anything but. Over a 5-day period, prisoners experienced increasingly brutal psychological abuse at the hands of the guards of the Stanford Prison Experiments. This is their story. But before we get into that, make sure that you like this video, subscribe, all the YouTube things, and finally just thank you for watching. Appreciate you even clicking on this, but let's get into it. On one quiet Sunday morning in August 1971, a Palo Alto, California police car swept through the city, picking up college students as part of a mass arrest for armed robbery and burglary. The suspects were picked up at their homes, charged, warned of their legal rights, and basically put up against the police car, searched and handcuffed. The suspect was then put in the rear of the police car and carried off to the police station. The car would arrive at the police station, the suspect was brought inside, formally booked, again warned of their Miranda rights, fingerprinted, and a complete identification was made on these people. The suspect was then taken to a holding cell where they were left blindfolded to ponder their fate and wonder what they had done to get themselves into this entire situation. So what the suspects actually had done was answer to a local newspaper ad calling for volunteers in a study of psychological effects on prison life. Basically, they didn't really know what they were signing up for at the end of the day, but they did sign up for this, so got themselves into it. Researchers wanted to see what the psychological effects were of becoming a prisoner or a prison guard, so both. To do this, the research team decided to set up a simulated prison and then carefully note the effects of this institution on the behavior of all those within its walls. Basically, guards, prisoners, everybody inside of this prison or simulated prison was being studied on. More than 70 applicants answered the ad and were given diagnostic interviews and personality tests to eliminate candidates with psychological problems, medical disabilities, or a history of crime and drug abuse. Basically, they just wanted a complete control group that they could use for this experiment. Ultimately, they were left with a sample of 24 college students for the US and Canada who happened to all be in the Stanford area and wanted to earn $15 a day by participating in a study. Now, on all the dimensions that the researchers were able to test or observe, these people were reacting normally to it. So these were the 24 that were actually going to go into the study. And so the study of prison life began then with an average group of healthy, intelligent, all middle-class males, specifically. The boys were arbitrarily divided into two groups. Half were randomly assigned to be guards and the other half were randomly assigned to be prisoners. So that's basically it. And it's super important to remember that at the beginning of this experiment, there were no differences between who was assigned a prisoner and who was assigned to be a guard. It was just a coin flip, random choice. So to help researchers closely simulate a prison environment, they called upon the services of an experienced consultant. Among them was a former prisoner who had served nearly 17 years behind bars. Basically, this guy knew the prison system like nothing else, you know what I mean? He had been there, he had done that. This consultant made researchers aware of what it was like to actually be a prisoner. He also introduced them to a number of other ex-cons and correctional personnel during an earlier Stanford summer school class, which they co-taught, called The Psychology of Imprisonment. So basically, he had been working with them already. Now, the prison itself was constructed by boarding up each end of a corridor in the basement of Stanford's psychology department building. To create the prison cells, they took the doors off of some laboratory rooms and replaced them with specially made doors with steel bars and cell numbers on them. That corridor was considered the yard and was the only outside place where prisoners allowed to walk, eat, or exercise, except to go to the bathroom down the hallway, which prisoners did blindfolded, so they actually did not know where they were and that they didn't know that they were out of the prison at all. At the end of the hall was a small opening through which the researchers could videotape and record the events that occurred. On the side of the corridor opposite of the cells was a small closet which became known as the hole or solitary confinement, whatever you prefer. It was dark and very confining, only about 2 feet wide and 2 feet deep, but tall enough that a bad prisoner, as they call it, could stand up. But basically you can picture just like a tiny ass little closet. That's basically it. An intercom system allowed the research team to secretly bug the cells to monitor what the prisoners discussed and also to make public announcements to the prisoners themselves. There were also no windows or clocks to judge the passage of time, which later resulted in some time disordering experiences for the prisoners and guards. And basically with all that set up, the jail was ready to receive its first prisoners who were waiting in the detention cells of the Palo Alto Police Department. Blindfolded and in a state of mild shock over their surprise arrest by the city police, the prisoners were put into a car and driven to the Stanford County Jail for further processing, which was actually just, like I said, the basement of the Stanford Psychology building. The prisoners were then brought into the jail one at a time and greeted by the warden, who conveyed the seriousness of their offense and their new status as prisoners. Each prisoner was systematically searched and stripped naked. They were then doused with a spray to convey the belief that they may be carrying germs or lice. The prisoner was then issued a uniform. The main part of this uniform was a smock or a short dress, which each prisoner wore at all time with no underwear, basically. On the front and the back of the smock was the prisoner's ID number. On each of the prisoner's right ankle was a heavy chain bolted on and worn at all times. Rubber sandals were the footwear, and each prisoner covered his hair with a cap made from a nylon stocking. Now, it should be clear that the researchers were trying to create a functional simulation of a prison and not a literal prison. Real prisoners don't wear smocks, but they do feel controlled and at times humiliated, which is why they had them wear these kind of dresses or smocks. The goal was to produce similar effects by quickly putting the men in a smock without any underclothes. And indeed, as soon as some of the prisoners were put in these uniforms, they began to walk and to sit differently and basically just hold themselves differently altogether. The chain on their foot, which was also uncommon in most prisons, was used in order to remind the prisoners of the oppressiveness of their environment. Basically, even when the prisoners were asleep, they could not escape the atmosphere of oppression. They wanted these prisoners to basically, every time they turned around in bed, you just hear the clanking and you basically remind yourself that you're in prison. You can't even have a good night's sleep. The use of ID numbers was a way to make prisoners feel anonymous. Each prisoner had to be called only by his ID number and could only refer to himself and his other prisoners by their numbers. The stocking cap on their head was a substitute for actually having to shave the prisoner's real hair off. And the process of having one's head shaved, which usually takes place in a lot of prisons as well as the military, at least in the United States, is designed in most part to minimize each person's individuality, since a lot of people just express their individuality through either style or length. As you can tell, got long hair. I love it. It is also a way of getting people to begin to comply with the arbitrary coercive rules of this institution in general. Now, the guards were given no specific training on how to actually be guards. Instead, they were free within limits to do whatever they thought was necessary to maintain the law and order in the prison and to command the respect of the prisoners. So you can just imagine how that's going to go. The guards made up their own set of rules, which they then carried into effect under the supervision of Warden David Jaffe, who was an undergraduate from Stanford University. They were warned, however, of the potential seriousness of their mission and of the possible dangers of this situation they were about to enter. Just like the guards, as with real prisoners, these prisoners expected to have some harassment, to have their privacy and some of their civil rights violated while they were in prison, and to get minimally adequate diet, all part of their informed consent agreements when they actually volunteered. So when these people signed up, they probably didn't know exactly what they were signing up for, but they signed up for all of this. So just keep that in mind. All guards were dressed in identical uniforms of khaki, and they carried a whistle around their neck and a billy club borrowed from the police force. Guards also wore special sunglasses, an idea researchers borrowed from the movie Cool Hand Luke, which were mirror sunglasses that prevented anyone from seeing their eyes or reading their emotions. This actually ended up helping to further promote their anonymity and basically let them be as either cruel or uncruel as they wanted to. Since the researchers were of course studying not only the prisoners but also the guards, who found themselves in a new power-laden role. It began with 9 guards and 9 prisoners in the jail. 3 guards worked each of 3 8-hour shifts, while 3 prisoners occupied each of the 3 barren cells around the clock. The remaining guards and prisoners of the sample of 24 were on call in case they were actually needed for the experiment. The cells were so small that there was room for only 3 cots on which the prisoners slept or sat, with room to do basically anything else. Basically, they were just sitting in bed all the time. At 2:30 a.m., the prisoners were rudely awakened from sleep by blasting whistles for the first of many counts. Now, the counts served the purpose of familiarizing the prisoners with their numbers. Counts also took place about several times each shift and multiple times at night. But more importantly, these events provided a regular occasion for the guards to exercise control over the prisoners. At first, the prisoners were not completely into their roles and did not take the counts too seriously. The prisoners were basically still trying to assert their independence. The guards too were feeling out of their new roles and were not yet sure of how to assert their authorities over these prisoners. This was the beginning of a series of direct confrontations between the guards and prisoners. Push-ups were a common form of physical punishment imposed by the guards to punish infractions of the rules or displays of improper attitude towards the guards or the institution staff. Now, when the researchers saw the guards demanding push-ups from the prisoners, they initially thought this was an inappropriate kind of punishment for a prison. Like, basically, it was kind of too kiddish. It was like more like something you'd make sports players do or something like that.
Now drop and give me 20.
However, they later learned that push-ups were often used as a form of punishment in Nazi concentration camps, as can be seen in this drawing by former concentration camp inmate Alfred Cantor. I hope I said your name right, brother, but it's also noteworthy that one of the guards also stepped on the prisoner's back while they did push-ups, or made other prisoners sit or step on the backs of fellow prisoners during their push-ups. Because the first day passed without incident, researchers were surprised and totally unprepared for the rebellion which broke out on the morning of the second day. The prisoners removed their stocking caps, ripped off their numbers, and barricaded themselves inside the cells by putting their beds against the doors. And now the problem was, what were they going to do about this rebellion? The guards were very much angered and frustrated because the prisoners also began to taunt and curse at them. Basically, just, like being shitheads, end of the day. When the morning shift guards came in, they became upset at the night shift guards, who they felt basically were being too lenient on these prisoners. The guards had to handle the rebellion themselves, and what they did was fascinating for the staff to behold. At first, they insisted that reinforcements should be called in. The 3 guards who were waiting on call at home did end up coming in, and the night shift guards voluntarily remained on duty to basically help the morning shift. The guards met up and they decided to basically treat this force with force, so they were fighting fire with fire. Speaking of which, they actually got a fire extinguisher which shot a stream of skin-chilling carbon dioxide, and they forced the prisoners away from the doors. The guards broke into each cell, stripped the prisoners naked, took the beds out, forced the ringleaders of the prison rebellion into solitary confinement, and then just generally began to harass and intimidate the other prisoners. Now, although the rebellion had been temporarily crushed, the guards now faced a new problem. Sure, 9 guards with clubs could put down a rebellion by 9 prisoners, but you couldn't have 9 guards on duty at all times, and there's always 9 prisoners. So it's obvious that the prison budget could not support such a ratio of staff to inmates. So what were they going to do about it? One of the guards came up with a solution: let's use psychological tactics instead of physical ones. Psychological tactics amounted to setting up a privilege cell. Now, one of the 3 cells was designated as a privilege cell, and the 3 prisoners who were least involved in the rebellion were given special privileges. They got their uniforms back, got their beds back, and were allowed to wash and brush their teeth. The others were not. Privileged prisoners also got to eat special food in the presence of other prisoners who had temporarily lost the privilege of eating at all. So basically, if you were in this privilege thing, you were pretty lit, like you had it good. The effect was to break the solidarity among prisoners. After half a day of this treatment, the guard then took some of these good prisoners and put them into the bad cells, and then took some of the bad prisoners and put them into this basically good cell or privileged cell, whatever you want to call it, which thoroughly confused all of the prisoners. Some of the prisoners who were the ringleaders now thought that the prisoners from the privileged cell must be informers, and suddenly the prisoners became distrustful of each other. The ex-convict consultant later informed researchers that a similar tactic is used in real prisons by real guards to break prisoner alliances. For example, racism is used to pit blacks, Chicanos, and whites against each other. In fact, in a real prison, the greatest threat to any prisoner's life comes from fellow prisoners. By dividing and conquering in this way, guards promote aggression among inmates, thereby deflecting it from themselves. The prisoners' rebellion also played an important role in producing greater solidarity among the guards. Now, suddenly, it was no longer just an experiment, no longer a simple simulation. Instead, the guards saw the prisoners as troublemakers who were out to get them, who might really cause them some actual harm. In response to this threat, the guards began stepping up their control, surveillance, and aggression. Every aspect of the prisoners' behavior fell under the total and arbitrary control of the guards. Even going to the toilet became a privilege which a guard could grant or deny at their own whim. In fact, after the nightly 10 p.m. lights out lockup, prisoners were often forced to urinate or defecate in a bucket that was left in their cells. And on occasion, the guards would not even allow these prisoners to empty these buckets, and soon the prison began to smell of urine and feces, further adding to the degrading quality of the environment, basically. These people are just living in a shitty situation. The guards were especially tough on the ringleader of the rebellion, who was prisoner number 5401. He was a heavy smoker, and they controlled him by regulating his opportunity to smoke. Researchers later learned, while censoring the prisoner's mail, that he was a self-styled radical activist. He had actually volunteered in order to expose the study, which he mistakenly thought was an establishment tool to find ways to control student radicals. In fact, he had actually planned to sell the story to an underground newspaper when the experiment was over. However, he fell so completely into the role of prisoner that he was proud to be elected the leader of the Stanford County Jail Grievance Committee, as revealed in a letter to his girlfriend. Basically, This dude was proud to be this prisoner at this point, and he signed up for an experiment. He just got lost in the sauce at this point. Less than 36 hours into the experiment, prisoner number 8612 began suffering from an acute emotional disturbance, disorganized thinking, uncontrollable crying, and rage. In spite of all of this, staff had already come to think so much like prison authorities that researchers thought he was actually trying to fool them into releasing him. When the primary prison consultant interviewed prisoner number 8612, the consultant chided him for being so weak and told him what kind of abuse he could expect from the guards and prisoners if he were ever to go to San Quentin prison, which is just a giant prison in California. Prisoner number 8612 was then given the opportunity of becoming an informant in exchange for no further guard harassment. He was told to think it over. During the next count, prisoner number 8612 told other prisoners, "You can't leave, you can't quit." And that sent a chilling message and heightened their sense of really being in prison. Basically, they were falling deeper and deeper into these roles. Prisoner number 8612 then began to act crazy, to scream, to curse, and then to go into an uncontrollable rage. It seemed to take quite a while before researchers were actually convinced that he was really suffering and that they actually had to release him. They were basically just trying to keep him there for as long as possible. The next day, they held a visiting hour for parents and friends. The researchers were worried that when the parents saw the state of the jail, they might insist on actually taking their sons home. To counter this, the staff manipulated both the situation and the visitors by making the prison environment seem way more pleasant and benign than it actually was. They washed, shaved, and groomed the prisoners, had them clean and polish their cells, fed them a big dinner, played music on the intercom, and even had an attractive former Stanford cheerleader, Susie Phillips, greet the visitors at the registration desk on arrival. Basically, they were kind of forcing it. When the dozen or so visitors came, full of good humor at what seemed to be a novel, fun experiments, staff systematically brought their behavior under situational control. Parents had to register, were made to wait half an hour, were told that only 2 visitors could see any 1 prisoner, were limited to only 10 minutes of visiting time, and had to be under surveillance of a guard during the entire visit. Before any parents could enter the visiting area, they also had to discuss their son's case with the warden. Now, naturally, parents complained about these arbitrary rules, but remarkably, they complied with them, and so they too became part of this prison experiment, being good middle-class adults, just basically being sheep and just following along with whatever these people were telling them. Some of the parents got upset when they saw how fatigued and distressed their kids were. But their reaction was to work within the system to appeal privately to the superintendent to make conditions better for their own individual kid. When one mother told them that she had never seen her son looking so bad, researchers responded by shifting the blame from the situation to her son. "What's the matter with your boy? Doesn't he sleep well?" Then they asked the father, "Don't you think that your boy can handle this? Do you think he's strong enough?" And of course the father bristled, "Of course he can. He's a real tough kid, he's a leader. He's obviously these parents are wanting to believe that their kids can do this." Turning to the mother then, the father said, "Come on, honey, we've wasted enough time already." And to the staff, they said, "See you again at the next visiting time." So basically, they just completely blanked on the whole situation, why they were even mad, and just moved on because they basically questioned, is it your kid's fault or is it the situation's fault? Now, the next major event staff had to contend with was a rumored mass escape plot. One of the guards overheard the prisoners talking about an escape that would take place immediately after visiting hours. Prisoner number 8612, whom they had released the night before, was going to round up a bunch of his friends and break in to free the rest of the prisoners. So how do you think researchers reacted to this rumor? Do you think that they recorded the pattern of rumor transmission and prepared to observe the impending escape? That's probably what they should have done, of course, if they were actually acting like psychologists. Instead, staff reacted with concern over the security of the prison. Basically, they were falling more into their roles as well as the prisoners were. What they did was hold a strategy session with the warden, the superintendent, and one of the chief lieutenants named Craig Haney to plan on how to foil this actual escape plan. After the meeting, they decided to put an informant in the cell that prisoner number 8612 had occupied. The job of the informant would be to give information about the escape plot. The staff also went back to the Palo Alto Police Department and asked the sergeant if they could have the prisoners transferred back to the old cells. The request was turned down because the police department would not be covered by insurance if they actually had moved the prisoners back into their jail. And everywhere I could find, it said that the staff actually left angry and disgust at the lack of cooperation between the correctional facilities. And basically this just shows how completely enveloped in their role that they were, because they're not even realizing that they're like doing a psychology experiment. You're not a real prison. Then staff formulated a second plan. The plan was to dismantle the jail after the visitors left, call in more guards, chain the prisoners together, put bags over their heads, and transport them into a 5th floor storage room until after the anticipated break-in. When the conspirators came, Staff would tell them that the experiment was over and that they had sent all of their friends home and that there was nothing left to liberate. After they left, staff would bring the prisoners back and redouble the security of the prison once the liberators left. They even thought of luring prisoner number 8612 back on some pretext and then imprisoning him again because he was released on false pretenses. Now, one of the main researchers, Dr. Zimbardo, was sitting there all alone, waiting anxiously for their intruders to break in, when somebody happened to walk along, and it was a colleague, Gordon Bauer. Now, Gordon had heard that they were doing an experiment, and he came to see what was going on. The researcher briefly described what they were up to, and Gordon asked a very simple question. He said, "Say, what's the independent variable in this study?" Here, I'm going to read a direct quote from Dr. Zimbardo after Gordon asked her this. "To my surprise, I got really angry at him. Here I had a prison break on my hands. The security of my men and the stability of my prison was at stake. And now I have to deal with this bleeding heart, liberal academic effete ding-dong who is concerned about the independent variable. It wasn't until much later that I realized how far into my prison role I was actually at that point. That I was thinking like a prison superintendent rather than a researcher psychologist." Now, the rumor of the prison break turned out to be just a rumor, and it never materialized. Imagine their reaction, the staff's. Probably pissed after that. They had spent an entire night planning to foil the escape. They begged the police department for help, moved the prisoners, they dismantled most of the prison. They didn't even collect any data on that day. So, how did they actually react to this mess? Basically, the researchers and the staff in general were just pissed over this, and they decided that somebody was going to pay for this. The guards again escalated very noticeably their level of harassment, increasing the humiliation they made prisoners suffer, forcing them to do mental repetitive work such as cleaning out toilet bowls with their bare hands. The guards had prisoners do push-ups, jumping jacks, whatever the guards could think of. They even increased the length of the counts to several hours each. At this point in the study, staff invited a Catholic priest who had been a prison chaplain to evaluate how realistic the prison situation was, and the result was truly Kafkaesque. The chaplain interviewed each prisoner individually, and researchers watched in amazement as half the prisoners introduced themselves by their number rather than a name. After some small talk, he popped the key question. "Son, what are you doing to get out of here?" When prisoners responded with puzzlement, he explained that the only way to actually get out of prison was with the help of a lawyer.
"Hi, I'm Saul Goodman. Did you know that you have rights? The Constitution says you do."
He then volunteered to contact their parents to get legal aid if they wanted him to, and some of the prisoners did accept this offer. The priest's visit further blurred the lines between the simulation and actual real life. In daily life, this man was an actual real priest, but he had learned to play a stereotype program role so well. He was actually talking in a certain way, folding his hands in a prescribed manner, that he seemed more like a movie version of a priest rather than a real one. And this basically added more uncertainty that all these people were feeling already, because they were basically getting so lost in these roles. Now, the only prisoner who did not want to speak to the priest was prisoner number 819, who was feeling sick, had refused to eat, and wanted to see a doctor rather than a priest. Eventually, he was persuaded to come out of his cell and talk to the priest and superintendent so that they could see what kind of a doctor that he actually needed. While talking to the staff, he broke down and began to cry hysterically, same as the other two boys that they actually released earlier. They took the chain off of his foot, the cap off of his head, and told him to go and rest in a room that was adjacent to the prison yard. Staff said that they would go get him some food and then take him to actually see a doctor since he wanted to. Now, this is really messed up, but basically while they were doing this, one of the guards lined up the other prisoners and had them chant aloud,
"Prisoner 819 did a bad thing! Prisoner 819 did a bad thing! Prisoner 819...
And basically they shouted this statement in unison at least a dozen times, basically just shouting it up at this room that he was in. Now, as soon as the staff realized that prisoner number 819 could actually hear the chanting, they raced back to the room where they had left him. And what they found was a boy sobbing uncontrollably, while in the background, his fellow prisoners were yelling that he was a bad prisoner. And basically no longer was the chanting disorganized and full of fun like it had been on the first day. Now it was marked by utter conformity and compliance, as if a single voice was saying prisoner number 18 is bad. Through his tears, he said he could not leave because the other prisoners had labeled him a bad prisoner. Even though he was feeling sick, he wanted to go back and prove that he was not a bad prisoner. Basically, they broke this guy. And at this point, this is a direct quote. They said, "Listen, you are not prisoner number 819. You are," whatever his name was, "and my name is Dr. Zimbardo. I am a psychologist, not a prison superintendent. And this is not a real prison. This is an experiment. And those are students, not prisoners, just like you." When he heard this, he stopped crying. Suddenly, he looked up at the doctor like a small child awakened from a nightmare and replied, "Okay, let's go." The next day, all prisoners who thought they had grounds for being paroled were chained together and individually brought before the parole board. The board was composed of mainly people who were strangers to the prisoners, departmental securities, and graduate students, and was headed by the top prison consultant. Several remarkable things occurred during these parole hearings. First, when they asked prisoners whether they would forfeit the money that they had earned up to that time if they were to parole them, most said yes. And you gotta remember, most of these people only signed up to this because they were offering $15 per day that they were here. So the fact that they're giving up this money is kind of like a big deal, because the whole reason you're here is for the money at the end of the day in the experiment. You don't really care about that, you know? Then, when they ended the hearings by telling the prisoners that they had to go back to their cells while they considered their requests, every prisoner obeyed, even though they could have obtained the same result by simply quitting the experiment altogether. So they actually just went through with it. So the question is, why did they obey? Because they felt powerless to resist. Their sense of reality had shifted, and they no longer perceived their imprisonment as an experiment. They literally thought they were in prison. In the psychological prison that they had created, only the correctional staff had the power to grant paroles. Now, during the parole hearing, they also witnessed an unexpected metamorphosis of the prison consultant as he adopted the role of the head of the parole board. He literally became the most hated authoritarian official imaginable, so much so that when it was over, he felt sick at who he had actually become during the role. He basically became his own tormentor who previously rejected his annual parole request for 16 years while he was a prisoner. And basically, he hated himself after the parole ended, you know? By the 5th day, a new relationship had emerged between prisoners and the guards. The guards now fell into their job more easily, a job at which times could be boring and at times which was interesting. So, you know, you get the good and bad. There were 3 different types of guards. First, there were tough but fair guards who actually followed the prison rules. Second, there were good guys who did little favors for prisoners but never really punished them harshly. And finally, about a third of the guards were actually hostile, arbitrary, and inventive in their forms of prisoner humiliation. Basically, these guys took pride in being this prison guard that they were pretending to be, basically. These guards appeared to thoroughly enjoy the power that they wielded, yet none of the preliminary personality tests were able to predict this behavior. The only link between personality and prison behavior was finding that prisoners with a high degree of authoritarianism endured the authoritarian prison environment longer than other prisoners did, basically. The prisoners even nicknamed the most macho and brutal guard in the study John Wayne. Now, prisoners coped with their feelings of frustration and powerlessness in a variety of different ways. At first, some prisoners rebelled or fought with the guards. 4 prisoners reacted by breaking down emotionally as a way to escape the situation. One prisoner even developed a psychosomatic rash over his entire body when he learned that his parole request was turned down. Others tried to cope by being good prisoners, doing everything that the guards wanted them to do. So, 2 completely different situations. One of them was even nicknamed Sarge because he was so military-like in executing all his commands. By the end of the study, the prisoners were so disintegrated both as a group and as individuals that they were no longer any group unity, just a bunch of isolated individuals hanging on, much like prisoners of war or hospitalized mental patients. The guards had won total control over the prison, and they commanded the blind obedience of each prisoner inside. Researchers did, however, see one final act of rebellion. Prisoner number 416 was newly admitted as one of the standby prisoners. Unlike the other prisoners who had experienced a gradual escalation of harassment, this prisoner's horror was basically full-blown as soon as he arrived. Old-timer prisoners told him that quitting was impossible, that it was a real prison. Prisoner number 416 coped by going on a hunger strike to force his release. After several unsuccessful attempts to get number 416 to eat, the guards threw him into solitary confinement for 3 hours, even though their own rules stated that 1 hour was the limit. Still, prisoner number 416 refused to actually eat. At this point, prisoner number 416 should have been the hero to the other prisoners, but instead, the others saw him as a troublemaker. The head guard then exploited this feeling by giving prisoners a choice. They could either have prisoner number 416 come out of solitary confinement if they were willing to give up their blanket, or they could leave prisoner number 416 in solitary all night. Now, what do you think that they chose? Yeah, like you thought, most basically elected to keep their blanket and let their fellow prisoner just suffer in solitary confinement all night. However, the staff did intervene later and they returned prisoner number 416 to his cell. On the 5th night, some visiting parents asked staff to contact a lawyer in order to get their sons out of the prison. They said a Catholic priest had called them to tell them that they should get a lawyer or a public defender if they wanted to bail out their sons. They called the lawyer as requested, and he came the next day to interview the prisoners with a standard set of legal questions, even though he too knew that this was just an experiment. Alright, so basically everybody's going along with this, and at this point, it became very clear that they had to end this study because it was just getting way too deep. They had created an overwhelmingly powerful situation, a situation in which prisoners were withdrawing and behaving in pathological ways, and in which some of the guards were behaving sadistically. Even the good guards felt helpless to intervene, and none of the guards quit while the study was in progress. Now, it should be noted that no guard ever came in late for a shift, called in sick, left early, or demanded extra pay for overtime work. So it kind of seems like these guards were just enjoying the job. Researchers ended the study prematurely for two reasons. First, they had learned that through videotapes that the guards were escalating their abuse of prisoners in the middle of the night when they thought no researchers were watching and that the experiment was off. Basically, they were just abusing these people at night for no reason. Basically, a lot of these guards were just bored at night, and it ended up just driving them to be even more degrading and abusive to these prisoners. Secondly, Christina Maschelat, who was a recent Stanford PhD that was brought in to conduct interviews with the guards and prisoners, she strongly objected when she saw the prisoners being marched on a toilet run. They had bags over their heads, their legs were chained together, and they had their hands on each other's shoulders. Filled with outrage, she said, "It's terrible what you're doing to these boys." Out of 50 or more outsiders who had actually seen the prison, she was the only one who ever questioned its morality, or basically just the ethics of this entire experiment. Once she countered the power of the situation, however, it became clear that the study should be ended. And so after only 6 days of the planned 2-week prison simulation, the experiment was called off. On the last day, they held a series of encounter sessions, first with all the guards, then with all the prisoners, including those who had been released earlier, and finally with the guards, prisoners, and staff all together. They did this in order to get everyone's feelings out into the open, to recount what they had observed in each other and themselves, and to share the experiences which each of them had found to be quite profound. Clearly, if you lost your whole sense of reality in this prison experiment. They also try to make this a time for moral re-education by discussing the conflicts posed by this simulation and the researchers' behavior. For example, they reviewed the moral alternatives that had been available to them so that they would be better equipped to behave morally in future real-life situations, avoiding that or opposing situations that might transform ordinary individuals into willing perpetrators or victims of evil. Basically, they just wanted to make sure that they would integrate back into society normally after this, especially since they lost their sense of reality during this, so makes sense. And this right here, this is a direct quote from prisoner number 416 after he had spent a bunch of hours in solitary confinement. He says, "I began to feel that I was losing my identity. The person that I called Clay, the person who put me in this place, the person who volunteered me to go to this prison, because it was still a prison to me, it is still a prison to me. I don't regard it as an experiment or a simulation because it was a prison run by psychologists instead of run by the state. I began to feel that that identity, the person that I was that had decided to go to the prison, was distant from me, was remote until finally I wasn't that. I was 416. I was really my number." Now compare his reaction to that of the following prisoner who wrote from an Ohio penitentiary after being in solitary confinement for an inhumane length of time. He says, "I was recently released from solitary confinement after being held there for 37 months. The silence system was imposed upon me, and if I even whispered to the man in the next cell, it resulted in me being beat by guards, sprayed with chemical mace, blackjacked, stomped, and thrown into a cell, naked to sleep on a concrete floor without bedding, covering, a wash basin, or even a toilet." He says, "I know that thieves must be punished, and I don't justify stealing, even though I am a thief myself. But now, I don't think I will be a thief when I am released. No, I am not rehabilitated either. It is just that I am no longer thinking of becoming wealthy or stealing." He says, "I now only think of killing those who have beaten me and treated me as if I was a dog. I hope and pray for the sake of my own soul and future life of freedom that I am able to overcome the bitterness and hatred which eats me daily at my soul. But I know now to overcome it will not be easy." The study was terminated on August 20th, 1971. The next day, there was an alleged escape attempt at San Quentin. Prisoners in the Maximum Adjustment Center were released from their cells by Soledad brother George Jackson, who had smuggled the gun into the prison. Several guards and some informant prisoners were tortured and murdered during the attempt, but the escape was prevented after the leader was allegedly gunned down while trying to scale the 30-foot prison walls. This guy was just climbing for his life. Less than 1 month later, prisons made more news when a riot erupted at Attica Prison in New York. After weeks of negotiations with prisoners who held guards hostage while demanding basic human rights, New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller ordered the National Guard to take back the prison by full force, which resulted in a great many guards and prisoners being killed and injured. One of the major demands of the prisoners at Attica was that they just be treated like actual human beings, which, I mean, I don't think is too much to ask for at the end of the day. After observing their simulated prison for only 6 days, researchers could understand how prisons dehumanize people, turning them into objects, and instilling them feelings of hopelessness. And as for the guards, they realized how ordinary people could be readily transformed from the good Dr. Jekyll to the evil Mr. Hyde, per se, basically. You know what I mean? Anybody can get a job and just become an asshole because you get some power, is basically what they're saying. So now the question is how to change our institutions so that they promote human values rather than destroy them. And sadly, in the decades since this experiment took place, prison conditions and correctional policies in the United States have become even more punitive and destructive. The worsening of conditions has been a result of the politicization of corrections, with politicians vying for whoever is the toughest on crime, along with the racialization of arrests and sentencing, with blacks and Hispanics being overrepresented by far. The media has also contributed to the problem by generating a heightened fear of violent crimes. And basically today there are more Americans in prison than ever before. According to a Justice Department survey, there are over 1.5 million Americans currently incarcerated. Okay, so that was basically the entire Stanford Prison Experiment, completely broken down, explained everything. Let me know what you guys thought. Let me know if you guys have anybody who have ever went through the prison system. I definitely have. I still got people in there right now. Free them. Yeah, man, I don't know. I personally, in my mind, people might not like it, but I just don't agree with prison at the end of the day. Like, if somebody did something that's that bad, just take them out. You know what I mean? Like, don't waste your time. Don't waste our money. That's just like a force. Plus, bro, you literally a slave in prison at the end of the day. That's literally, it's legal slavery at the end of the day. It's in the Constitution. I don't know. To me, that's just fucked up, but that's my personal opinion. Let me know if y'all think differently. I don't hold it against anybody if they think differently, but, you know, it's just my opinion. So let me know what y'all think. New video coming out soon. Next psychological iceberg episode dropping probably this same week if I'm not super lazy, but, you know, we trying. Yeah, other than that, if you got this far, appreciate you. Love you. I'll catch you later. Deuces. Stay safe, stay dangerous.